Hi, you're on the Bible Forum. It's May 20th, 2018. I'm Warren Sprouse. We do this every Sunday night. I got a segment here I'm entitling, What a Difference a Day Makes. Anybody remember Paige Patterson? Dr. Patterson, Reverend Pastor Paige Patterson. Paige has more than 50 years of faithful service and ministry as a pastor, as an evangelist, as a professor, as a college president, seminary president, denominational leader, you name it, he's done it. Today he's being vilified for things he said, no doubt in sermons, decades ago. Things demeaning to women. Things which are no longer politically correct. And in his effort to apologize and to accept responsibility, have not been near enough for those who were offended. And part of the problem here is the times in which we live. You know, things move on. The Southern Baptist denomination has been thrust into a larger cultural conversation about the mistreatment of women and that institution's failures to protect them from powerful men who misbehave. Their commitment is to the safety and to the dignity of women. And all of that has now been called into question by Paige Patterson and his latest offering. Now, the reality here is that many men, pastors, have almost always been dismissive of women. They have. Love them to death. But we have almost always been dismissive. Much of it has been done in jest, been done in an effort to be cute or to be clever. I have never had any men friends who thought women should be barefoot and pregnant, or that they belonged in the kitchen, even as they voiced these sorts of things and other sexist comments. In my world, growing up, women would take those comments with a knowing look, maybe a sarcastic response, because all of it was done in jest or that was done for effect. There were times when it was harsh and hurting, but they usually didn't come from the church or from Christian men. The women and the men knew who was really in charge around the house, and it wasn't Bob. It was Barbara. Still is. However, I have known men, pastors, who believe women to be either inferior or at least not as equal in opinion or value as men. Those among the independent, fundamental, Bible-believing Baptists were probably the most obvious and the most offensive. However, for the most part, the women in their congregations believed the same kind of thing. Not to the same extent, but maybe because it was preached so often and so forcefully, I don't know. But there didn't seem to be a great deal of embarrassment nor offense generated by saying such things. Seem being the operative word. The 1950s and 1960s were entirely different than the early 21st century in terms of social contracts and behaviors. The culture of that day was not as socially aware in terms of female sensitivities, proclivities, at least not before the 1960s. Dr. Patterson's comments, admittedly, were in the long past. These are not new things that he has said. The report is indicating he said it decades ago in that context, only to be judged today by today's context, by today's sensitivities. Being judged for something you said or did 20, 30, 40 years ago? It's patently unfair, unless someone was legitimately damaged by that. And of course, young women today feel damaged by words they've never heard, at least not firsthand. Words that were never spoken to them. Words which were accepted, even acceptable, when they were spoken. The article in question uses the word snafu to describe Dr. Patterson's silence on this critique, while the Southern Baptist denomination he represents squirmed and suffered from its public critiques. I don't think that the author of this article is in favor of Dr. Patterson. I think this author is in favor of the women. But here's the thing. I was raised by a World War II U.S. Marine. I know what the word snafu actually means. It's not a word. It's an acrostic, each letter representing a word. Words that I will not repeat here nor anywhere. Should I take to the proverbial streets to castigate this author for his rude, disgusting, and shameful use of language? Something he's probably too young to actually know anything about. I say all of that to demonstrate how toxic our atmosphere is today. Social media has given voice to an entirely unseen, unaccountable group of people. And should someone not respond in deference to their sensibilities, real or otherwise, that someone simply proves the critic's right. Dr. Patterson admits telling a wife to get down on her knees by the bed she shared with her husband and to pray aloud in regard to his abusive behavior. A wife who then showed up in church with a black eye. A husband who was also in church that day, the article said, and who made a public profession of his sins and apparently changed his ways. And that is now being characterized as abusive. Abusive by Dr. Patterson. Now, I remember when that sort of counsel was normal in some circles. When pastors really thought that way and counseled even harsher remedies. I remember thinking these men were not very far from the proverbial backwoods and needed a dose of biblical reality. And I suppose there are still some around. The religious groups of which they were members were, and may still be, starkly real and rough-hewn. However, why are these folks judging a man's behavior which is 40 or more years old instead of that which is more recent? Say the last 10 to 20 years. What has his testimony been? And the answer? They're doing it for effect. They're doing it to embarrass. They're doing it to demean, for public notoriety, perhaps for money. No one can change their past or anyone's past. No one can force others to embrace their value system. If Dr. Patterson is such a terrible person, then don't go to that college. Don't go to hear him preach. Don't support him or any group he leads or represents. Don't read anything that he has written. It's your choice. But his critics are suggesting that they are Christian and his behavior was, well, not. Of course, Christians are called by God to forgive. Forgive when confronted by confession of sin. They may not forget. They may never trust again. But they can't hold the grudge against one who has acknowledged their guilt, their sinful behavior, attitudes, words, and given evidence of change. And it appears that Dr. Patterson has done all of the above. If that's not enough, If that didn't go far enough, if that wasn't specific enough, then help him understand privately. But clearly that's not what's motivating these critics. These folks are out to destroy his life. For what? For effect, for notoriety, for moral superiority, for power. Seems to me like there's a sin in here somewhere, don't you? Tell me what you think.